You know, it's interesting whenever you come to one of these, and I guarantee you could have invited the Bush girls or the Obama girls or Chelsea Clinton, whatever. If you're the son or daughter of a former president of the United States, we all get the same question. And I got it out there several times in the hallway before I came in. Everybody wants to know how often you get to go back to the White House. And they have this perception that you get this, once you get this secret key that gets you in the White House, that you get to go back there all the time, and it's, you know, it's just easy to do. We left the White House, or at least I did, after Dad lost the election to Jimmy Carter in January 1977. And I had not been back to the White House until I went back in 2003 when then sitting President George Bush invited Dad and Mom and the whole family to come back to celebrate Dad's 90th birthday. And so I hadn't been back to the White House in, 30 plus years. And we went back there, and President Bush was kind enough to have us there, and they were going to have a big dinner and everything. And before the dinner, he said, "Would you like to go over and see the Oval Office?" And my two brothers, my sister Susan and I, Dad and Mom, sure. So we went over, and I hadn't been there since I was, probably a 19-year-old kid. So we go to the Oval Office, and President Bush is showing us, and I'm looking around thinking, my gosh, I was a 19-year-old teenager in this Oval Office, and, it looks the same, still oval, promise you that nothing has changed there. But so then we go over, before the dinner, they have a big dinner for Dad for his birthday in the East Room of the White House, and the Bushes were very kind to invite us up to the second floor of the White House, where they have the family quarters. And so we went there for a little reception, and again, I'm walking around thinking, my gosh, I used to live here in the White House, and there's a screen door that leads out onto the south balcony that overlooks the south lawn of the White House. And I walk through that screen door, and I sort of stop, and I'm just soaking in all the excitement of the moment and thinking back, and I look over to my left, and in a perfect line is Vice President Dick Cheney, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan, and then me. And it's like one of those pictures you see, and underneath it says, "What doesn't belong here?" So I asked Alan Greenspan to leave. No, I wouldn't do that. I promise you. Well, this is exciting to come back. First of all, I want to thank Shannon, and we had a great dinner last night with Tom, Bill, and Todd, and some of your board members, and Dr. Gresham. I want to thank you for being my guest at lunch today, and but to come and be able to talk about ethics. And it's a fascinating subject. I mean, it would take hours upon hours. You've got so many different topics: personal ethics, governance, medical ethics, the golden rule. And I, as an actor, am fascinated. When I build a character, when I get a script, that's one of the first questions I ask about a character in a script. That's how you find out what a character will do in his life and why he reacts to certain things. You have to figure out his ethics. You have to figure out why he would think about doing something and why he wouldn't do it. And it's much deeper than just an opinion. And as an actor, that's how you mold a character. And you figure out whether it has character or an integrity or those kind of issues. And as an actor, I got to play good guys and bad guys. And ethics played a huge role in how you determine what that character would do or not do with the surrounding situation in the movie you worked on. I mean, ethics are just fascinating. You think about, the Robin Hood principle. You steal from the rich to give to the poor. Obviously, stealing is unethical. But giving to the poor, there's some moral value to that. So how do you balance all these things? It's a fascinating topic. I know last time I was down here, we talked about, I think, the financial crisis that just happened then, and you had all these mortgages, and You had a situation where you had very, very sophisticated loan officers convincing very unsophisticated applicants that they could afford certain loans. And it worked the other way. You had applicants that misrepresented information on a loan document to convince somebody they could afford a mortgage. And that's how we got into that situation, and all of a sudden that big bubble was created. So ethics are a fascinating, fascinating thing. They've asked me, before I get into the part about talking about some of the stories about Dad and things like that, to share some of the funny little stories, interesting stories. I brought some pictures with me to sort of all the screens around. You'll see the pictures. I want you to walk out of here after lunch and realize the families that live in the White House, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, it doesn't matter, that they're real families. And hopefully the stories I tell and some of the pictures I bring will make you think that, let me get this remote on there, I think we're good now. This is a picture of our family back in 1975 on the cover of Time magazine. That's my sister Susan on the left, myself, my brother Jack, my brother Mike, his wife Gail, Mom and Dad. And hopefully these pictures, some of you in the room are old enough, these pictures will jog memories for you of what was going on in the room. And I'm so pleased. I see a lot of students in the room, and this will be a little bit of a history exercise for you to realize how my father was the first man to become president of the United States that did not go through a general election. That'll probably never happen in the history of this country again. So hopefully you'll walk out of here and realize that these are real families that go through a lot of the same things you go through. This is a picture of Air Force One. This was the Air Force One when Dad was president. It's an old 707. If you ever go to California and go to the Reagan Museum, you can actually walk through this plane. It hangs in a huge hangar in the Reagan Museum. It's unbelievable. You walk right through it. The new Air Force One is a big 747, which basically makes this look like the Wright brothers plane. Trust me, the way it is now. But okay, I've got a quiz for you. Let's see if anybody in the room can figure this out. This picture was taken the day after Dad lost the election to Jimmy in November 1976. This picture was taken the next morning in the Oval Office. That's my sister Susan on the left. That's me giving my mother a hug. Does anybody recognize the man in the middle? That's your former Vice President, Dick Cheney. He was 33 years old, youngest chief of staff at that time, and he had hair, obviously, and he had that warm, friendly smile, you know. Some things never change, I guess. So let's see what else here's Mom with the Queen of England. Of course, Mom had to wear the bigger hat, right? And no, the Queen came for the bicentennial. It was a big deal, America's 200th birthday. And when you have a dignitary of that status come, you hold a state dinner. And the Queen and Prince Philip, her husband, came. And what happens at a state dinner is the President and the First Lady, they go down and meet the dignitary at the diplomatic entrance. And they walk him in, they take him up to the second floor of the White House, the family quarters. And they have a little small chit-chat there. And then they go down for the big state dinner into the East Room of the White House. So Mom and Dad are all dressed up. And, usually it's black tie. This was white tie and tails for the Queen. They went downstairs, the elevator. They go out to the diplomatic entrance, and they walk the Queen in, and Mom and the Queen are standing at the family elevator waiting to go up to the second floor. And what my mother doesn't realize is that my 21-year-old brother Jack is down in the basement. He has not finished dressing for the dinner, is coming up the elevator, and all he has on is a pair of Levi's and no shirt. Now, you can imagine my mother standing with the Queen of England all dressed up as the elevator door opens, and there's my 21-year-old brother Jack in Levi's and no shirt, right? She was horrified. Thankfully, the Queen had a sense of humor. She looks at my mother and she goes, "Don't worry, Betty, I have one of those at home too." So I figured it out time-wise. That would have been Prince Charles. So let's see. Oh, so let me give you a little background on myself. In fact, I was talking to a couple of the students before. When I was their age, that's when Dad became president. I was 18 years old. All of a sudden, I was getting ready to, I'd been accepted to Duke University, supposed to go to school at Duke in 2 weeks, freshman year. All of a sudden, Dad becomes president of the United States, and I get 10 Secret Service agents. Trust me, that is not the group you're hoping to hang out with at 18 years old. I'm trying to visualize moving into the freshman dorm with 10 guys with machine guns and radios, and it just doesn't really work for me. So I walk into my dad's office there, the Oval Office, and I say, Dad, I'm just not ready to go to college right now. I want to take a year off. This whole thing with you, becoming president and the Secret Service, I just need time to collect my thoughts. I'll go back to school next year. And he says, okay, what are your plans for your year off? And I said, Dad, I have this dream, I have this vision to go out west and be a cowboy. And he's like, what? A cowboy? What? I mean, that was like one notch above starting a rock and roll band in the garage, right? And thank God I had parents allowed us kids to kind of go off and do our own thing. And so instead of going to Duke University, I took my 10 Secret Service agents and headed west. And it was just like, what was the movie Billy Crystal did? City Slickers, yes, City Slickers. So we took their coats and ties off, and here's a picture of me and my 10 Secret Service agents. That's me in the corner. Those are my guys right there. And we actually put them on horses once in a while. You can see it was like a giant posse, right? Aren't you glad to see what your tax dollars were doing back in 1974? Yeah, I rodeoed and cowboyed, and I'll show you this picture here. This is a picture of me team roping. I was a team roper professionally. I wasn't any good. I wasn't going to make a living at it, but that's me on the right. To show you how bad I was, this is a picture of me getting bucked off what we call a bareback horse. And I didn't bring this picture to show you how bad I was. Brought this picture to show you the guy on the fence up there with the sunglasses on. That's my Secret Service agent, okay? Now, my impression or understanding was that whenever my life was in great danger, you know, they were going to leap into action. And if we go to the next picture, you'll see my life is in worse danger. He has not moved. So I question what their mantra is there. So cowboy and rodeo got me in the TV and film business. Spent several years, 6, 7 years on the daytime show Young and the Restless, and then eventually moved into film. And this is a picture from a movie I worked on, Black Hawk Down, and I'm dressed as one of the Delta soldiers, but the two civilians, or guys dressed in civilian clothes there, are two of the Delta soldiers that fought in Somalia and Mogadishu, where we lost 18 brave Americans. And so that was a fascinating movie to work on. Well, I want to help the young folks in this audience understand how got catapulted into the White House. And this story happened back in October of 1973 because of that man right there who was Richard Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew got caught in a bribery scandal, had to step down from office, and Richard Nixon was looking for a new vice president. And the list was probably 7 or 8 deep, and the top of that list was people like former Republican governor of New York State, Nelson Rockefeller, former Democratic governor of Texas, John Connally, who had switched to the Republican Party. My dad, Jerry Ford, who had been a congressman for 26 years from Grand Rapids, Michigan, he was a House Minority Leader, was probably considered to be at the bottom of that. Richard Nixon was looking for a new vice president, and everybody on that list was told that at 7:30 that night, the president or the White House was going to call whoever they chose to be the next vice president. And then at 9 o'clock that night, they were going to hold a national press conference in the White House to announce who the nominee was. Now, to put this story in perspective, we lived outside of Washington, D.C. in a little town, Alexandria, Virginia. We had a little 3-bedroom house, 2 different telephone lines in our house. One was a public line, so, you know, listed in the phone book, probably three extensions, maybe 4. And then my parents had a private line in their bedroom with only 1 extension. And we're all eating dinner at 7:30 that night, and the private line rings in my parents' bedroom. My sister Susan picks it up, yells downstairs, "Dad, it's the White House." Go upstairs, and Dad picks up the phone, and on the other end of that phone was General Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff at that time. And General Haig says to my father, he says, "Congressman Ford, the President of the United States has something he thinks both you and your wife Betty should hear at the same time. Could you put your wife Betty on?" And before my dad could tell him there was only 1 extension, the President of the United States gets on the phone. And the next thing we hear my dad say is, "Mr. If you could just call back on the other line, Betty could get on," and he hangs up. And now, I admit I was only 17 at the time, but that just didn't feel like a career move. Got very still, very quiet. You know, I had vision. What about if they don't know the phone number, right? I've got visions of Al Haig and Richard Nixon going through the phone book. We sat there, got very still, very quiet for 5 minutes, you know, and then a little rumblings in the back, you know, "Way to go, Dad." And finally, and this is how history is made. I mean, this is as strange as history is. You hear these kind of stories. 5 minutes later, the President of the United States calls back on the other line so that my mother could get on the phone with Dad, and they could truly enjoy that moment together in their marriage as they enjoyed so many other moments. That was October of 1973, and Dad becomes Vice President of the United States. At that time, Watergate was it wasn't a small item in the news, but it hadn't grown to the proportion that it would later, and we all know our history. And over the next 10 months, Richard Nixon's presidency was under siege. And 10 months later, this is a famous picture of my parents walking the Nixons out on the south lawn of the White House after he had resigned. And it's interesting, protocol calls for the vice president to always walk behind the president. And on this occasion, because of the very unique transfer of power here, Dad chose to walk next to Nixon as they walked out to the helicopter. And I think everybody probably in this room will remember this picture of Richard Nixon saying goodbye to his staff, family, friends on the south lawn of the White House. We stood there, my 2 brothers, my sister and I, Mom and Dad, about 30 feet away as the helicopter got ready to take off. We backed up. Helicopter took off, flew to Andrews Air Force Base to take Richard Nixon to Air Force One, which would fly him to California as we prepared to walk into the East Room of the White House where Dad would take the oath of office. We're in a different, well, listen, we're in the middle of a new transition of power in this country right now. But most times when you have this new election or a new president, there's celebrations, there's galas, there's parties, there's parades, those kind. That's not what this was. This was a constitutional crisis. You had a man who was now going to walk into the East Room of the White House, put his hand on the Bible, take the oath of office, who had not been elected by the American people. This had never happened in the history of this country. And you think of what Dad, the reins that were being handed to him of what was going on. You had a war in Vietnam. You had a Cold War with the Russians. In fact, let me back up even further. 12 months before Nixon resigned, the price of oil on the free market was $3 to $4 a barrel. In the 12 months that led up to Nixon's resignation, the price of oil went up 300% to 400% to $12 a barrel. Stock market, 6 months before Nixon resigned, was at about 1,000 points. It lost 47% of its value 6 months leading up to Nixon's resignation. So here you had a man, Dad, who was going to be the next president, had not been elected, was going to walk in, take over the Vietnam War, the Cold War with the Russians, energy crisis. Inflation was 14%, unemployment was 9%, and this was a constitutional crisis. Most countries, if you had a change of power like this without an election, you would have troops in the streets. But not America. We figured out a way to have a peaceful transfer of power. This is a picture of when we walked in. Mom took the Bible and Dad took the oath of office from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is a picture of all the kids. We sat in the front row, watched Dad be sworn in. And this was our first family portrait after Dad had been sworn in. Nixon had cleared off his desk the night before. We walked into the Oval Office, Dad laid down the Bible, and that was our first family portrait. Now think about it. 10 months earlier, my dad was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan, getting ready to retire after 26 years. My mother was so happy. Her husband was finally going to get out of politics. She'd get out of Washington, D.C. They were going to move back to Michigan. All of a sudden, Dad becomes vice president of the United States. She was not happy about that. But I'll never forget my father at dinner that night putting his arm around my mother going, "Betty, don't worry. Vice presidents don't do anything." And that didn't really work out that way, did it, Dad? So, but now think about this. We didn't get to move into the White House, okay? You would think after your father becomes president of the United States, you get to move in the White House, right? Well, Nixon resigned so quickly, so unexpectedly, that they weren't able to pack up all their belongings, their clothes. So they left their daughter and son-in-law, David Eisenhower, to pack all the boxes. It took 7 days. So that night, after this picture of us in the Oval Office, we didn't get to move in the White House. We had to go back to our little house in Alexandria, Virginia. This is a picture of our first family meal after Dad becomes president, sitting around our little dinner table in Alexandria, Virginia, suburbia. And you women will get a kick out of this. I will never forget my mother cooking dinner that night, saying, "Jerry, something's wrong here. You just became president of the United States and I'm still cooking." But that was our reality. That's what happened. The next day, in fact, for the next 7 days, that's what Dad had to commute to the Oval Office. Got up every morning and drove. Now, he had Secret Service driving him, but commuted to the Oval Office every day. So can you imagine that, for that type of transition to sort of happen today? It just wouldn't be able to happen. Well, as you heard, it was a tough time to be an American president. You had the Vietnam War, you had the Cold War with the Russians, you had troops still in Vietnam, the war was winding down. Troops were still coming home in body bags. This country was being ripped apart on college campuses. You had protests everywhere. And you had a terrible economy, this energy crisis. Now, it's interesting. Dad was only president basically less than 1,000 days, same thing as John F. Kennedy. And when he left office, he'd gotten all the troops home from Vietnam. Stock market was back over 1,000 points. Energy crisis, they'd done some things to help solve that. The economy was moving again. Inflation had been cut from 14% down to about 4%. Things were moving again, but that's not what he's remembered for. What's the one thing my father is remembered for? The Nixon pardon. That will be his legacy. The Nixon pardon, no matter what he did for the economy or getting troops out of Vietnam, it'll be the Nixon pardon will be his legacy. And if he were here today, he would tell you the same thing I'm going to tell you, is that that decision ended his political career, and he knew that. He knew that was going to happen. But he was making a long-term decision instead of a short-term fix for his own political career. He was thinking long-term, and we live in a society that long-term is not, people don't think much about long-term. Everybody's instant access. You want answers now, now, now. The Nixon pardon was interesting. In fact, one of the first things he had to do was go against his own attorney general. Nixon had asked that all his documents, papers, tapes be sent to California the next day. Dad said, absolutely not. There's still a criminal trial pending for Richard Nixon, and that would be evidence in a trial. Dad, listen, Dad knew if all that was sent to California, the next day there was going to be a bonfire on the beach. That's just the truth of it. The Secret Service there was so much material, it was stored on the second floor, they were afraid the roof was going to cave in of all the boxes that were stacked up there. His attorney general, who Nixon had appointed, Dad inherited, so it really wasn't Dad's attorney general, ruled that every president, former president, owns their papers, documents, all that. But Dad ruled against his own attorney general to keep that evidence there at the White House. I think the one thing that changed Dad's mind the most about the pardon or the potential pardon was after he spoke to Leon Jaworski, who was a special prosecutor. And he asked him, he says, how long can Nixon drag this out in the courts? And Leon Jaworski said 3, 4, maybe 5 years. And I think Dad said this country cannot take Richard Nixon in the headlines, in the courts for the next 3, 4, 5 years. We've got an economy we've got to heal. We've got to heal from a war. We've got a Cold War. And he knew he had to get Nixon out of the way to have his own presidency and deal with the nation. Now, they knew Nixon was not going to admit to doing anything wrong. That was not going to happen. Now, obviously, later in his own books, he did. So they found a Supreme Court ruling, I think it was from 1933, it was called the Burdick case, where a man was held in federal custody by the feds, and they wanted him to testify in a trial, and they said, we'll give you a pardon if you'll testify for us. And he refused the pardon on the condition that the Supreme Court had ruled that if I grant you a pardon, that's an implication of your guilt. If you accept that pardon, you accept that guilt. Well, Mr. Burdick said, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not taking your pardon because I'm not accepting the guilt. It was called the Burdick case. So when they went to Nixon to talk about the pardon, they said, this pardon is given under this ruling that, Mr. Nixon, if you accept the pardon, you accept the guilt. Nixon initially turned it down, said no. Days later, came back and accepted the pardon under those conditions. Now, it's interesting. The pardon cost my dad his political career. They figure the pardon cost him anywhere from 5 to 15% of the vote. He would tell you that he was thinking long-term, not short-term. And I remember talking to him myself. I said, Dad, they're going to, people were mad about what happened at Watergate and the cover-up and the president. And I said, Dad, they're going to crush you. And he sat me down and he talked about the idea that a president is like a father of a family. And when you have kids, and I'm sure he was talking about me. He says kids will get out of line, they'll break rules, there's, all these things happen, and he says there's consequences and you got to pay a price, and that's understood. And but a father, if he thinks that carrying out the full consequence or the full extent of the law will divide the family, the father has a choice to maybe have some grace and mercy in that example. to save the whole family. And Dad used that analogy to say that, you know, we could have prosecuted Nixon to the complete extent of the law. It would have divided the country. It wasn't worth it. The good of the whole country, the family, was the most important thing. So it cost him election, but I would say that 20 years later, it came full circle. And 20 years later, he was invited to the John F. Kennedy Museum and Library by Senator Ted Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy to receive the John F. Kennedy Award for Profiles in Courage because of the Nixon pardon. Because of the Nixon pardon. And Ted Kennedy stood up there and said, Mr. President, I was one of your biggest critics. I told the country you sold it out. You did the wrong thing. And I stand here today corrected. You did the courageous thing to heal a nation. And I remind you of that story because we live in a society, it's short-term, short-term, short-term. Nobody's thinking long-term anymore. So I think it's a worthy thing to think about. It's interesting. We were talking a little bit of politics at dinner last night, and it's a different age now. It's gotten so toxic. My dad's best friend was the Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. They would fight on the floor of Congress every day and hammer out some compromise legislation. And then Tip O'Neill would be at our house for dinner that night. They would break bread. And my dad would tell you today that, and I've got friends still back in Washington, and they tell me Democrats and Republicans don't socialize at all, that the lines are drawn. And my dad would tell you that how is he going to find an answer with some, if I don't break bread with you, or I don't know where your daughter's going to college, or what your dog's name is, it's relational. It has to be relational. When Dad probably shouldn't have been the next vice president when Nixon nominated him. But who came forward to support Dad? Carl Albert, who was a congressman from this state for a long, long time, a very powerful, lot of integrity and character. And Carl Albert was the Speaker of the House, and Mike Mansfield was the head of the Senate, both Democrats. And they met with Richard Nixon. And he floated the ideas of a Nelson Rockefeller and a John Connally. And they said, no, you're not going to get those through Congress. And Richard Nixon asked him, who can I get through Congress? They promoted Dad's name. Not because he was the greatest intellect, the greatest speaker, he wasn't. But because he, I think, had the character and the integrity and the ethics to work with people. And that's what Carl Albert said. Jerry Ford, we can work with Jerry Ford. He's able to compromise and work with both sides of the aisle. And politics has gotten so toxic today, we're not seeing that. So I think it's something worthy to think about. If you go to the United States Capitol, we just, about 5-6 years ago, put a statue of Dad there in the rotunda. And I was on the committee that helped that statue, and I sent my mother 30 quotes of Dad's to possibly put on the base of that statue. And there was one other quote that wasn't Dad's, and I said, Mom, what are the quotes you want on there? And the first one she picked was not a quote of Dad. It was a quote by Tip O'Neill. And she said, I want Tip O'Neill's quote on there, and I'll paraphrase it for you. It's very close. Tip O'Neill, who was the Democratic Speaker of the House, said, God has been very good to America. During the Civil War, he sent Abraham Lincoln, and during Watergate, he sent Gerald R. Ford, the right man at the right time to heal a nation. We don't have that kind of politics anymore. And we've got to start talking to ourselves again and talking to each other and reaching out and finding those common bonds. So it's something worth thinking about. Well, before I get into the serious matters of my talk, I brought a few pictures that will show you behind the scenes of what living in the White House and the president does. This is a picture from a state dinner in Japan. And at the head table, they have a custom that you pass this wooden reed from one guest to the next. The trick is you can only hold it with your upper lip and your nose, okay? Now, you can see from the picture, Dad is not real excited about this, but I want to show you what he did for the American people. So, he didn't think that was on his job description, I'm telling you. This picture will prove that our life in the White House is just like yours, okay? I admit I had better government housing. I admit that. But this Dad had a dog named Liberty. It traveled with him all the time. He loved this dog. And this dog slept in Mom and Dad's bedroom. And one night the dog got up in the middle of the night and had to go to the bathroom. So the dog goes and wakes Dad up. He puts on his bathrobe and slippers, right, and takes the dog down the elevator. They go out the back diplomatic entrance at 2 in the morning, right, and dog runs around and does its business on the lawn, and Dad grabs the dog and he turns around to go back in the White House. What do you think happens? The door's locked. And the Secret Service don't even know he's out there. And the next picture you have is the President of the United States at 2 in the morning knocking on the back door trying to get back in. And I'm sure that happens at your house too. So this next picture, now, this is for all the men in the room. Okay, guys, I brought this picture for you. This will drive home the point of how our house, your house, just the same, okay? This will show you who truly ran the White House. You guys have never had that look at home, have you? I think we know who's going to win that argument there. Well, I want to talk now in the closing time I have and share with you really the most important lessons I ever learned from my father. And it really happened about 3 months before he passed away, back in 2006. I was in a federal prison in Texas, but that doesn't sound right. I was not in prison. Okay, that sounded wrong there. I was in a prison, and I was doing what my parents had taught me to do. I was in there to try to help speak to about 200 men that were in a special program that were trying to transform their lives, trying to, once they got out of prison, stay off drugs and alcohol and not be absentee fathers. And I was in there to give them a talk. I'm a recovering alcoholic, 23 years of sobriety due to the grace of God and a good 12-step program, and sober, and listen, it's a grace of God on my life, and I can stand here and tell you I know what unethical behavior is. I recognized it in my own life, and there had to be a change, and there had to be a transformation, and I stumbled a great deal, and 23 years ago picked up my life and got sober. And so I travel around. I speak in prisons, juvenile detention facilities, halfway houses, high school students. I've spoken to about 65,000 high school students about drugs and alcohol and things like that. So it's funny, when I got sober, my mother's Betty Ford, right? She did Betty Ford Center and all. And so she was just like every other mother. When I went to my mom and I said, "Mom, I think I'm an alcoholic," and she goes, "Oh no, my son can't be an alcoholic. Oh no." I said, "Mom, stop, wait. You cannot be in denial. You're like Betty Ford, and you're like the poster child for this thing." And at that moment, she was just like every mother in the country. You don't want your son to be an alcoholic. And it's funny because people think I probably went to the Betty Ford Center. It's not like we have a family wing or something, where I got the family discount or anything. I didn't. I went to AA and got sober, outpatient. And so let's go back to the story. I get sober. I'm now in a prison speaking to men, trying to reclaim their life. And we're in there, and I give my little story and my testimony and the grace of God in my life. And my gosh, a young man stands up and he says, tell us a great story about your father's career, being president and vice president and a congressman and all the success. And I say to him, I say, young man, you probably don't know this. You wouldn't know this. My dad's very ill right now. He's sick. He's 93 years old. He's probably going to pass soon, 3 months, 6 months. But I know at that moment, soon I will be at a state funeral for my dad. And, you know, the trumpets will be playing and the parade and the cannons and the flags, and they'll be honoring my dad as a former president. And I said to that young man, I said, you know, my father's greatest value at that moment, at that time, is not going to be me remembering what he did to bring troops home from Vietnam or dealing with our allies or dealing with the Russians. That's not going to be his greatest value to me. What he did dealing with the Chinese or to get troops out of Vietnam, dealing with our allies. His greatest value at that moment is going to be what he did to lead our family. That's going to be his greatest value, not his career. And I promise you, when I was there at his funeral, I didn't think about what he did to get the troops out of Vietnam or deal with the Russians. I thought about how he led our family, how he showed us how to be a great father, a great husband. That was his greatest value. And that same young man stood up and said, well, if you won't tell us a story about his career, tell us who he was, the fabric of his character, who he was. And so I thought about it, and there's a lot of stories I could have talked about, but the story I shared with those 200 men in that prison is the same story I'm going to share with you at lunch today. My dad played football at the University of Michigan. And if I could tell you only one story, if you asked me one story, what would be the pearl, the one story, this would be it. My father was. We were lucky enough 20 years ago to go back to the University of Michigan. They retired his jersey. He played football there on 2 championship teams, national championship teams. He was captain of the team. I haven't seen my dad cry much on the field there with 110,000 people in the stands at Michigan, the big house. He had tears running down his cheeks. This is a picture of Dad when he played football at the University of Michigan. President Lyndon Johnson used to say about my dad, he goes, that dang Jerry Ford played too much football without a football helmet, you know. And they were actually good friends. So, and here's a picture of the team. Dad was number 48. What the story is, that after they retired his jersey, we were walking off the field. And a man pulled me aside and said, I want to tell you a story about your father and what he did when he was playing here at Michigan in the 1930s. He says, your dad in 1932 and 33 played on two championship teams, undefeated, 10-0 both seasons. In 1934, your dad was captain of the team. They were supposed to play a team, Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, at that time in 1934, was an all-white school. Michigan had one black player in his team, number 61, Willis Ward. Georgia Tech found out that Michigan had one black player, and Georgia Tech said they would not take the field, they would not play the game if Willis Ward suited up for that game. Now, listen, this isn't about Georgia Tech. Back in 1934, that's what happened. All the northern schools, to get the southern schools to come play the northern schools, they would bench their black. It was the old Jim Crow laws. That's what happened. The man who was telling me the story said, your father was so incensed that his good friend Willis Ward, Dad and Willis Ward roomed together when the team traveled. He He said, your father was so incensed that Willis Ward couldn't play in this game that he was going to quit the University of Michigan football team to make a stand for his friend Willis Ward. Now, Willis heard about it. My dad and convinced him to stay on the Michigan team. He says, I'll sit down, Jerry. You've got to play the game. You're captain of the team. My dad decided to play. Now remember, Michigan had come off 2 undefeated seasons, 10-0, national champions. In 1934, the next year after those 2 titles, Michigan's record was 1-8. They won 1 game and lost 8. But the only team they beat was Georgia Tech, 9-2. Now I got to tell you, I'd never heard that story. Dad had never told that story, didn't wear it on his sleeve. I'm standing there. And this man looks at me who's telling me the story. He says, son, do you know what character is? I'll be honest, I couldn't speak. I had tears running down my eyes. Character is what you do when nobody's watching, and nobody was watching your father as a 20-year-old kid at the University of Michigan in 1934, willing to make a stand for his friend Willis Ward. That was 1962, I think, before the ACC, University of Maryland, had a black player on its team. Dad and Willis Ward went on to be great friends the rest of their life. You would know about Willis Ward. He actually was a great sprinter. He beat Jesse Owens when I think Jesse Owens was at Ohio State. He decided not to go to the Olympics in Germany because he didn't want to be persecuted like he'd been against Georgia Tech. But I walked off that field and I thought, my gosh, I don't have any Willis Ward stories. I don't. What kind of stories am I going to be able to give my kids, my grandkids, about my character, my integrity? And it challenged me that day to really think about what we leave behind and that legacy we have. I'm going to leave you with one other thing, and we're going to leave a couple minutes for some question and answers at the end, and I'll be glad to answer anything you have. I want to give you a tool to take home, something you can do for yourself. This is a book that my dad gave us kids, and he took out a yellow legal pad, and he picked 20 subjects that he thought were important to a young man or a young woman growing up in this country today. Subjects like, what is character? What is integrity? Making and keeping friends, learning how to compromise. He wrote a one or less handwritten essay about those 20 little subjects that he thought were important, and he put it in a book, he bound it, and gave it to us kids. This is a copy of it right here. And it's all handwritten, and you can see, I'll show you, this is one of them right here. You can see it's not even a full page, handwritten. And this one is Learning How to Lose. I think I have it on the, let's see if I put this, yep, I got it on the side there. This is what he wrote, Learning How to Lose. And now, I want you to go home and think about this. Do it for your kids, your grandkids. If you don't have any kids, a kid down the street doesn't have a father. Speak in prisons. I'll tell you why this is so important. When I go speak in juvenile detention facilities or high schools, and I can only speak to the male side of this, I can't speak to the female side. But our young people are getting a very confusing message. And it's coming from movies and TV and pop culture and things like that. And it's men, young men, that are confusing maleness with being a man. Think about that. They're confusing maleness with being a man. And when I go in and talk to these young men, and pop culture is just totally doing that. I tell them, I go, maleness is something you inherit. It's a trait. You have done nothing to get maleness. It's a trait. It's territorial. It's aggression. It's, competition. Those are just male traits that we get for doing nothing. But being a man is something so much deeper, and it's actually taking those traits of maleness and using them for service for people around you or below you, to help lift people up. And when you just have maleness, raw maleness, without manhood, without character, without integrity, operating on its own, untempered, it brings trouble and wreaks havoc on people's lives. You have to have the element of character and integrity, ethics, and those kind of things. You just can't have raw maleness. And I see it in detention facilities, in high school. Young men are confusing maleness with being a man. And being a man is something you earn, and maleness is something you inherit. And so a book like this, with these characteristics, when Dad wrote it and gave it to it, now listen, I don't want to set you up for failure because you're thinking, oh, well, you're all excited now. You're going, oh my gosh, I'll do this for my kids. They'll be so excited. No, they won't. Okay. Remember when Dad gave me my book? I was in like my early 20s, and he came in and said, oh gosh, I got this great book for you. It's about character and integrity, and I want to be accountable and all that, and here's the book. And, you know, I'm sitting there going, oh boy, Dad's being weird again. I didn't get it. I did not get it. Okay, and the same thing might happen to you with your kids or grandkids. But don't give up. Because 10 years later, when my life came crashing down because of alcoholism, this book made sense. This book was like a Bible to me. You know, it was given by my father and given in love, and this book was a guide to get me off my knees and reclaim my life. So don't think you're wasting your time if you don't get a great reaction. It'll show up sometime in their life, and they'll. Let's read this one together. This is Learning How to Lose. You think, wow, that's a strange subject to write on, to talk about. It actually makes sense when you hear it. And you've got to write it, you have to write it with your own handwriting. Don't type it. Typing means nothing. Anybody can type. You want it, there's providence that happens when you get your real handwriting of your father or your mother. Learning how to lose. In this highly competitive society, there's always a winner and always a loser. Even the best sometimes lose because of circumstances beyond their control or because of unintended mistakes. But to walk off the playing field as a sore head or with a public display is not good for one's conscience or for one's reputation. Losing should be looked upon as a lesson so you can do better next time. The disappointment should not bemoan the spirit, rattle one's composure, sidetrack a well-organized plan, or preclude another effort. Learning to lose is to recognize that one setback is not the end, but in reality can be a new incentive to reach and achieve higher goals. Son needs to hear that. Daughter needs to hear that. So I challenge you to go home, write this, do it for your kids, do it for your grandkids. You'll make a huge impact. I want to close by just giving you one thought. I remember being with Dad, and Billy Graham was speaking at Dad's museum and library, and they were back in the green room, the waiting room to go out. And I remember hearing Billy Graham talk, and Dad asked him what he thought the greatest challenge was coming of the next century. And I'll never forget Billy Graham's answer, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but I think you'll get the idea. He said the greatest challenge is not going to be science, technology, medicine. That's not going to be the greatest challenge. The greatest challenge is going to be the taming of the spirit, the taming of the heart, the delay of personal gratification. And I think he's right. I think he's right. And all those elements have to do with character and integrity and ethics. And thank you all very much. I appreciate it. God bless you. I'll be glad to answer a few questions. I know we got to get you out of here by 1 o'clock, so I'll be glad to answer a few questions, and then Shannon can. Shannon is. Shannon wants to know about my mother and what a great woman she was. You know, I could do a whole speech on Mom. She changed history in her own way. She really blossomed when, you know, she was the one that raised us kids. Dad was on the road a lot. Mom was the one that got us to the dentist and the doctor and football practice. All you mothers out there know how that works, and that's a tough job. And so when we got to the White House, all of a sudden Mom didn't have to raise kids anymore. And I think God put on her plate some challenges that she was supposed to work on. And 2 weeks after we moved into the White House, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was 1974. At that time, women, if you know, you did not talk about breast cancer. You could not on TV, let alone breast cancer. And that was a closet disease for women. Women actually committed suicide before they would talk about or get a surgery. Mom had to go in and have a mastectomy, and she and Dad felt very strongly that this was terrible. There was a shame on this disease. And so they stood on the front lawn of the White House in front of the press, and they said they were going to take the shame off this disease for women, and that was 1974. So that was very courageous of her at a time when women about that. Now, she was challenged again 4 or 5 years later when she went through alcoholism and drug addiction. And she found herself, Mom, very typical of what happens in the community of recovery, she was prescribed legitimately pain medication for a serious pinched nerve in her neck, and by combining that with alcohol, and it created a cocktail that created an addiction, and her life came tumbling down. In a courageous way, she raised her hand and said, "My name is Betty, I'm an alcoholic," and again, changed the face of the stigma before, or the stereotype had always, you know, it was like the Skid Row bum, not a former First Lady. So Mom stood up and kind of took on 2 causes, and yeah, we're really proud of her. Listen, my mother was very outspoken, and she got in a lot of trouble. She was trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed for women. That was not really a platform in the, you know, something in the Republican platform at that time. It wasn't in the Democratic platform either. So neither party claimed the Equal Rights Amendment for women. She was controversial in that way. Dad loved her for it, supported her. There was a famous story about my dad, right before the election was going to be over, by the last month or so of the election, he was meeting with the political types in the Oval Office. And he was still trailing Carter by several points. And the political type said to my father, they said, "Now, Mr. President, we want to be very, you know, very gentle about this, but do you think there's any chance that maybe until the election's over, you could convince your wife to just keep it down a little bit until the election's over?" And my laughed, and he said, he says, "My wife's office is right down that hall." And he goes, "I know she's in there right now. And anybody in this meeting that would like to get up and go talk to her, you're more than welcome." Said nobody moved. So he loved her, he supported her, and she was very controversial. I mean, you know, when she first walked into the White House, they gave her a tour, and they walked in and they were showing, they said, "Now, this is the president's bedroom, and the president sleeps here, and your bedroom, or the First Lady's bedroom's down the hall." And Mom said, No. There'll be no need for a second bedroom. I'll be staying with the president. I've been doing that for years." But that was the custom at the White House, is the First Lady and the president slept in different bedrooms. She didn't think that was needed anymore. So she always liked shaking things up, and we loved her. She was a great mother, and thank you for asking, Shannon.